to do. I promised in the email that we would look at citations and bibliography, and we will be doing that. It'll probably be the version that we come up with today will be a little bit basic, but hey, Zach, nice to see you. The version that we do today will be a little bit basic, but we're going to start somewhere, and then we can develop it later on, you know, based on feedback or based on aesthetics, I guess you would say. Oh, awesome to see. This is pretty new for me, so I appreciate the shout outs in the chat. That way I know I'm not alone. And I can see there's a little counter, but I'm just going to have to get used to the sound of my own voice and saying things. So yeah, seeing those shout outs helps me know that I'm not boring anyone, I guess I would say. So citations and bibliography. Before we do that, we have a little bit of setup to do for our project, which will be helpful to teach how to set up a pollen project. So, and we have also, you know, some basic stuff to implement. This is our pollen cookbook only has one page right now, and we'll probably keep it that way for now. We'll put chapters in later, but you notice I did some code in here. This should show up as a block of code, and it's not doing that. So we'll just do some things like code blocks probably. I'm assuming if you're watching, hey Nick, how's it going? I'm assuming if you're watching that you have tinkered with pollen or read the documentation. And that you're on board with what pollen is and what it's going to take to what you're learning, I guess I would say. This whole thing started because, well, I would say the format of this thing is kind of driven by the questions that come up of the form. How do I do X in pollen? Can pollen do citations and bibliography? Can pollen do footnotes? Can pollen do this? Yes, pollen can do everything. It can probably do things you haven't thought of, but it's kind of up to you to do it. And so I'm going to be showing with these videos how recipes, you know, that for how to do various things. Just like cooking, you can cook it up a million different ways. You might get burned doing it some ways, but that's part of the fun. So, project setup. Let me change into, let's make this a little bigger for you. Okay. We don't have much in the repo right now. And let me open a tab for it here. I set up a GitHub repo for this project. It's this other Joel is my profile name, and then the cookbook-pollen has everything that we have here so far. If I'm in this folder, I actually should have another tab to start up the project server, just so that we're seeing it live here. Raco pollen start. Okay. So now if I refresh this page, we know for sure that it is in fact failing. I think I switched Racket versions between when I opened that tab and this. So what I'm going to do is, you might run into this. You can just do Raco pollen reset, and then do it again. Okay, that's working. that's working. When you Pollen kind of is a Racket program, and it compiles and saves a cached copy of itself when it compiles. And so if you switch Pollen versions, if you upgrade the Pollen package, or if you upgrade Racket as a whole, you kind of ensure that there's going to be weirdness until you delete that cache. So that's kind of what happened there. Okay, so here's our project. Right now we have the simplest viable Pollen project, which is this pollen.rkt file and a single Pollen markup document. Let's open that document. File, open recent example. Okay, there's not much there. Not sure where it's getting this other content. Where did I put that? Let's just I'm going to save that. Pollen will notice and rebuild. This is the wrong example file. I apologize. You can tell I'm really good at this. Okay, we're going to go code. Cookbook. There's the one I want. In our mic check session on Sunday, I went over kind of how to do these beautiful Racket style tooltips. This is almost entirely a CSS trick.
Dad,
Oh, hi Silas.
I want you to see the big, large slide. Just come and see.
You want me to come see? I'll come see when I'm done, okay?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Come here, Saz.
Nope.
Daddy's talking to some people, okay? Come here.
Ow! Cold!
Oh my.
Well, that was my 4-year-old. And my lovely wife. So, okay, so we did these tooltips. This is the markup for the tooltip you see there. And then there's really not a lot of smarts in it. If we look at the source for that, let me switch this around here. You see that it's basically a span with some styling and a little bit of JavaScript and an on-click event. So if you go into the GitHub repo, you can kind of see the CSS that is powering that. I've filled out the CSS a little bit since Sunday's session. There's a lot of this stuff at the top, but when we need CSS for a particular thing that we cover, I'm going to try and flag it up in the CSS file so that it's obvious what applies to what. And this is all that CSS. So that's where that's coming from. We kind of covered that on Sunday. Now we want to kind of, if I'm going to have a book with Pollen code about Pollen code, I kind of want to be able to have code blocks. So before we get to citations and bibliography, I wanted to do this code block tag. It's not really implemented right now. If you look at the content of this, what is inside that code block, you'll see that it's actually resulting, this code block tag in Pollen is creating a code block tag in HTML. And if you know your HTML, you know there is no code block tag in the HTML spec. But browsers will just leave it in there anyways. They'll say, oh, this must be some new tag I don't know about yet. What we want to do is actually have this spit out the correct block level element that would look like a normal code block. So I'm going to open our pollen.racket file. Let's go, I don't know how I got here. Documents. got code, we got cookbook, and we got pollen. What happened to my window? Maybe I was opening something else. See here. Okay. Here's our pollen.rkt file. All of this up here is not really required anymore, but I was just kind of demonstrating how you can get from, if you know what HTML you need to generate, you can kind of paste it in a comment and kind of use that to generate an X expression or a tagged X expression that is the equivalent of the same thing. I'm going to delete that for now. Here's our tooltip function. There's a defect in this tooltip function that I'm going to explain. I'll get back to that though. I don't want to get too distracted. I'm easily distracted. So, Racket is going to appear to be a little slower than normal because a lot of my CPU is being used up by the stream itself. So, just bear with me here. If it gets a little bit too hard, then I can just switch to Vim or something that isn't trying to do all kinds of syntactic analysis while I'm typing. It's not an actual IDE. So we need to define a function in our pollen.rkt file code block, and we want it to accept any number of elements. In fact, before I do that, I'm going to run this source document here. Don't save. It produces the X expression that is represented by this markup. And you can see if we look at the code block that's generated, there's only one line in there. Let me put more lines of code in there. What if, well, let me just, I should make it actual code. If true, yes, no. Okay. Let me run that now. You'll notice that the code block, if we look at this code block, what is generated in this expression, this code block bit is, it starts here and ends here, and you can look at this as though it were a function call. It's calling the function code block with these arguments. And the pollen reader, everything inside the curly braces is interpreted as a string, but it's not all one giant string. It's split up. It gets split up. Each line break becomes its own string. So in reality, code block might be called with, if there's only one line, it might be called with only one argument. If there's multiple lines, it's going to be called with as many arguments as there are lines, plus the number of line breaks that are in there. So as I've said before, we need to make it so that we can accept, between 0 and infinitely many arguments in our code block function. So we're going to do that with this dot notation. Same thing I've done up here. I'm going to call the list of arguments elements. And okay, now what do we want to do? We probably want the typical thing to do in HTML is a pre-tag, and maybe I'll give it a class, a code class, or we could just do it with plain. And then we'll do a code, and then we will do we're going to insert our elements here. That's a whole function. Now, the backtick, as I've explained before, means we're starting a quoted expression. And but the backtick allows you to do some escaping. So if I want to adjust, insert the contents of a variable, I guess you'd call it a variable, inside that expression, I could do that. And let's just run this, and we'll play with it a little in the interactions area down here. Let's say code block my code. I'm just going to give it a string, and it's going to give me back this expression. But you notice that because elements is a list, it is surrounded by its own pair of parentheses. And you don't want that pair of parentheses around there. I mean, I could explain why, but I don't want that pair of parentheses. Who is it? And so what the at does is it drops that pair of parentheses.
Looking for
Hi.
the heater. I'm sorry.
What?
We need the heater.
I took the heater, but do you really need it?
So we really like it for watching.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I need it for some more heat to get in.
Okay, here you go.
I got wet.
Yes, you did.
And
That's
I want-
amazing.
And I want to close up.
Okay. Kids need their heaters. I was trying to keep the electricity bill down, but, you know, at some point, you're raising kids, not electricity. Okay, so the at sign, comma at means splice it in. Splice the contents of the list into the outermost, into the surrounding expression. So we do the same thing we did before. Notice we dropped that outermost pair of parentheses. This is pretty much exactly the markup that we want, because now if we use the toHTML function, thanks for the love. Zach is, it's good to know people are, I told Jess, the kids are going to barge in. Just let them barge in. It's fine. Nobody wants to end up like that British ambassador or whoever it was. So if we use this HTML function on the results of code block now, we get our nice little pre-code block. This HTML function again is coming from the Pollen template package. I don't think I do need to provide it to my template, so I'm going to add it into my provide list up here. Otherwise it will be available within here but not to any other files in my project, so I'm going to provide it back out again. Now let's go back. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to our live example here, see how we did. I'll tell you why we didn't get the result that we were expecting. This is something you're going to run into over and over again as a beginner or an intermediate or an expert, is that everything that you define in your pollen.rkt needs to be provided. Otherwise, other modules can't use it. So a trick to avoid having to manually require every single function that you define, you can just say in addition to HTML, you can use this all defined out function. And that is a bit of macro syntax that's going to look through your document or your module and provide every function that it sees defined in there. Now let's save that. Now let's refresh our cookbook. And it looks like we have ourselves a code block. If I scroll down into here, there is a good old-fashioned pre-tag with a code tag inside it and the contents of our block code tag. I didn't save this. Let me do that again and get the full effect. Now it doesn't look exactly the way I want it to look, which is fine. I can load up our styles. style.css.pp. I'm using another Pollen convenience here. Let's put it up here. This is a Pollen preprocessor file. It is called style.css.pp. Any Pollen preprocessor file basically gets turned into the file without the .pp at the end. So this is going to become style.css. And it's, if you've used any CSS preprocessors, I generally haven't, like SAS or less. You'll be familiar with what's going on here, but it's basically a Pollen preprocessor is basically a text file with smarts in it, with code. And I've taken a pretty light hand here, but because of the way I do stuff with websites, I like to be able to define a line height that I can later change in one place if I want to, and then tweak it without having to edit it everywhere else it appears. So I have a line height here of 1.4. I have a I have a line height string. So this is a numeric value. This is a string value with the REM appended at the end. And then if I want to get a multiple of my line height, I can use this x line height function, and it will multiply that by my line height. So for example, down here in my headings, I'm saying give me a half of a base line height as the margin bottom value for my headings. So that's what you see in there. Again, you can poke through the style.css file. What we want is some styling for the looks like I started on this, but I committed the classic blunder of my selector didn't match what I ended up going with. So I'm gonna go like that. Pre-code. So if a pre is followed by a code, I'm not so sure this is a great idea, because this selector will apply to the code element. That could be fine. But let's see. Now I've saved this file. The Pollen server that is running in the background down here will notice that I've changed it and will regenerate it. So when I refresh this, there will be a longer than normal pause before. Oh, okay, so there it is. Now I'm using the font that I want. I'm getting the background that I want, but I'm getting, because code is not a block level element, I'm getting this kind of thing here. So probably what I want is I should just go with what I had before and have a class pre.code that applies to the pre element. Save. Let's go back here. Back to our code block function. Instead of code tag, I'm going to strip that out. I'm going to have a class code. Again, in Racket, the square brackets, the round parentheses, and the curly braces. This is within a Lang Racket file. Not Lang Pollen, but Lang Racket. These parentheses are all interchangeable. They have to match, but they're syntactically not different. So we have pre-class with code there. Save that. And this has been saved, so let's go back to here and refresh. Oh, we got a problem. I didn't match my parentheses. We got too many. It says read syntax unexpected parentheses. Now I get a single block of gray with my code in it, which is good enough for now. So that's a code block element. We're going to want that when I write up what we talk about here. then I'll want to have code examples, and that gives me what I would need. So that takes care of that. We got some project setup done. We got some code blocks. Let's talk about citations and bibliography. The simple thing, one of the simple ways to do it. Well, I should just stick with the same paradigm that I've started with. I could, if you need functions in a document, but you're not going to need them across your whole project, you can actually just define them right here in your Pollen file. I can just, I can define, wowie, and it's going to take an element. I'm just going to make it an N, and I'll just say, give me back format. Format A, wowie. This is kind of like a Racket version of a format string. And then you can use it in your file. You can use it with the parentheses, or you can use it in the other format, which it's just a matter of aesthetics, really. Wowie 1. So there's an example of an empty wowie tag. I didn't spell it right. You guys are all screaming at me right now. Hover over it. Dr. Racket has helpful things that can tell you, if you hover over something and it can't tell you where it's coming from, there's something amiss there. Refreshing. There's wowie 1 right there. I could change this to, you guys get the idea. You can define functions inside your Pollen files. And you can see, again, Dr. Racket IDE is very helpful. You can hover over the identifier and see where it's coming from. Normally, you need to require a functions module in order to be able to use it, but Pollen is nice and gives you certain things for free. I think anything that is in the Racket base is included in there. And if you're never sure, you can always right-click on a function and hit search help desk for and go right to it. I'm not sure why it's not coming up here. I think I need to rebuild my docs because, again, I updated Racket right before this video, which was not advisable. But, if you hover over that, you'll see a tooltip that tells you what exactly you need to require in order to get it normally. Just a little tip there. So we could define what we want to do is we want to be able to, let's just start with what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to say something important, and then we want to be able to cite. And I'm going to get rid of this tooltip for now. We want to be able to cite let me just paste in some text here from the documentation so that it looks okay. Okay, we want to be able to cite something. We want to be able to cite a work. We're going to say, docs, maybe. And then, at the bottom, we want to be able to say something like what LaTeX has, insert bibliography. We could do this to tell it we're calling a function with no arguments, or we can do this style to tell it we're calling a function with no arguments. But that's essentially what we want to be able to do. And then what we want to end up with is a nice little tooltip that says, you know, here's the name of our thing, and we want maybe this to be a link of some kind, and then we want an alphabetized list of all of the things that we cited to appear at wherever we put this insert bibliography function call. This is kind of the pattern of things where you have kind of a lookup table. So why don't we do this? We're probably going to need another thing here that says and for simplicity's sake, let's just decide up front for this example that we need our citations to be defined before they're first referred to. So we would have a thing called define citation docs, and that's going to have the content of our citation, and we're going to say Racket reference. So I'm going to use an I tag, Racket reference. You know, another tag function that we're going to need is for hyperlinks, but I think I'm just going to use an HTML default for now. Page 3. I want to show that you can use styling inside of these things. So let's say we want to do that. And let's, you know, again, for simplicity's sake, we're going to just do them all at the top of the document and have them appear down here and have the references, kind of the footnotes show here. So this is, now we know what kind of functions we need and what they kind of need to look like. And at this point, you'll quickly find that whatever you want to do, it's a small matter of building up your Racket muscles, your Racket vocabulary, because Pollen is a Racket language and it gives you access to the entire Racket library of code. So what we're going to do is be using what in Racket is same as many other programming languages, hash table. By the way, if you're programming in Racket, you can have this Racket reference from the docs, either your local copy or at docs.racketlang.org. The data types chapter is going to have a lot of what you need to get started programming in Racket. You're going to want to know how to, like, if you need to refer to like a tab character, you know, or if you need to pick out a substring of a string. It's all the same kind of things you need to learn when you're learning a new language. So Racket reference data types. Look around in here. It won't always explain why you might want to use a particular data type, but if you know what you're looking for, it's very easy to find. Boxes. I'm a very middling Racket programmer. I still have no idea what boxes are really for, except that I think it has to do with interfacing with C programs or something like this. Hash tables are basically a key value lookup. And so we're going to create a hash table called Citations table. And we are going to, there's two different ways to create a hash. You can create a mutable hash table, which can be changed, and an immutable hash table, which can be updated. The difference is with an immutable hash table, you don't ever change it directly. You pass it to a function that changes it and passes you, that function then returns a new hash table. For this, we're going to use a good old-fashioned mutable hash table. And I think we just use the hash function, which produces... Oh, no, we want to use... I always forget which one it is. It's either hash or it's make hash. I believe we want make hash. Creates a mutable hash table. Okay, so we're going to do make hash. Okay. Now it's empty. It's just... you can pass in some keys and values to give it, but to start with, it'll be empty. What was our other... So define citation. We're going to need define citation. Define citation. The first argument is going to be the key. And you'll recall, again, same thing with our code block. We might have any number of different things in here. Let's run this. Now you see, anything that doesn't have a function for it just kind of leaves intact. But this is what that function call will look like. It's going to pass in a symbol or an identifier, and it's going to give it this I expression. With a bracket reference as a string, and then another string with this. So we're going to have to accept, again, any number of arguments. Anytime you're creating a tag function type of thing that you're going to have, text content inside it, you're often going to run into this. So the dot, and we'll call it LMs for elements. That's any number of elements. And then we're going to do... go back to our documentation here. Hash set. Because this is a pattern in Racket. Racket is, of course, kind of a functional programming style. So anytime you actually mutate or change a variable in place, you're going to see that exclamation point in the function name. That's just kind of a Racket convention. It's telling you, hey, you're mutating a variable. And that's not always what you want, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it that way. So we're going to do it that way. Hash set citations. I'm just, again, going off of the documentation here. I had the advantage over you in that I knew the hash set function existed to begin with, but citations table. And then what does it need? It wants a key and then a value. So I can just give it a key. And then I'm going to just give it the list. Okay. Let's save that. Let's go back to our document. Let's run it. See if I get any errors. I don't get any errors. You'll notice that the define citation is no longer in our document expression. That's because the return value of hash set is void. It doesn't return a value. It just updates the hash. So because the return value is void, technically what happened is that a void value, void is a first class value in Racket, got inserted in here, and then Pollen took it out for us because void really is nothing. There was no reason to leave it in there. But if I say, now what is citations table? I'm in my interactions area. Again, remember, the book is a program. We just ran this program. Now we can interact with it. Citations table. Citations table is now a hash table that contains a key value, a single key and a value associated with that key. And now I can hash ref citations table docs. And I get out this list, essentially. So we can use that then with our cite tag. We can see now that what the direction we're going to be taking with the cite tag is to basically call hash ref and then wrap the output of that in some palatable value. And we are going to make it extremely palatable. So, cite. I forgot. Define. Cite. First argument is always going to be the key. Actually, we're only going to take one argument. Sorry, I shouldn't have put an apostrophe there. We are only ever going to take one argument for this function. If we try to do any more, we get an error. But we only need one. Start our x expressions here. I could do it, what if I just put it in a span, and then I can escape with that comma, hash ref. Same thing I did on the other side there. Citations, table, key. Saved it, run it again. Well, yeah, we'll run it here. Let's look at the hash ref function for a moment. Where is it? Right here. Hash ref. I've only passed it 2 arguments. I could pass it a 3rd argument, which is, what do I want hash ref to give me if the result doesn't exist? What I should do, say, if I don't, this can either be a function or just a value. I'll just use a value. So if I don't have anything in there, I'm going to just create a little error message for myself. No def for a key. And let's make this a little more readable. Okay, so I'll always get something back now. If I don't get the thing I wanted, I'll get an error, little error message that I created for myself. We can test that out. Always good to do before you start at the source. Cite. Now, right now if I cite it, you'll recall within this module I haven't defined any citations. So I'm going to get that error message. If I go back to our document, I should get a span with this reference inside it. It's not going to be quite right because this is another thing you're going to run into. You're going to get an error message like this. A contract violation. And what that almost always means is that you have created something that isn't a valid tagged X expression. And I don't have time to get into tagged X expressions now, but they are covered in great detail. The key portion is in the 2nd Pollen tutorial. You scroll down here to X expressions. This is an essential Pollen concept. But I'll cut to the chase here. The span that we generated, it contained a list, kind of I don't know what to call this. I wish I knew the academic terms for these things, but it contained this list of elements, and we don't want that outermost pair of parentheses. I don't know if I can interact with it the way I did before. Okay, so this is what we've defined, and this all becomes a list, and that whole list is what gets stored in the hash table. But again, this is another situation where we don't want that outermost pair of parentheses when we actually go to use it and insert it into an expression. So what we want is This is the naive way of fixing this, which is that comma at sign is going to splice the results back out again. But then our error message will not match. If we try and splice that, so watch this. We actually end up with a cons pair here, which is another malformed error expression. So now the other one will be correct, but this one is wrong. Nailing the X expression thing is key. And if you are familiar with HTML, it can be easy to grasp by looking at the thing and seeing if there's a straightforward conversion to HTML. That's why I love this section of the Pollen documentation, because it shows you, here's some HTML. Now let's slowly begin transforming it into X expressions. And you can see the result. And it's basically a list of lists. With the attributes of tags becoming their own little lists of lists. But if you look at Hello World, all the elements of the H1 tag have to be direct kind of children of that, or siblings of that first tag. They can't be in another list that has no name. They can be in another list if that starts with a tag, but not just an empty list, which is what we ended up with here. So the simple way to make this work correctly, now we want our error message, we just wrap it in a list. Say list. The list will contain a single string, and that list will just get, spliced back out again when it gets back to here, if it gets to that point. Now if I do site doc, I get a span tag that is what I want. Sancho in the chat has said, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, contracts have been super helpful. We will get into contracts at some point. I did early on in my Pollen life see the value of contracts. What contracts will do, basically, contracts are the idea that you can wrap, you can give a function a contract, and mainly what that gets you is a better error message. It'll say, this error message here is, we didn't get a contract violation until whatever this module was. Now, if we had contracts on all of our tag functions, we would have said, okay, you have an error in this tag. Here's the spot where it went wrong. This value was not what was expected. So that is nice. The thing about contracts in normal untyped Racket, which is Pollen is an untyped language, just like normal. There's Racket and then there's typed Racket. But in untyped Racket, contracts do impose a bit of a performance penalty. So the further I got into Pollen and the more I was doing it, I just decided, you know what, I don't need helpful error messages. I know what an X expression is like by now. I can spot, I have a better intuition for how things have gone wrong. So I tend to not use contracts on my tag functions, but that is a good way to go if you want if you're producing something that you want other people to be able to use with less trouble, for example. Yeah, so I think I got that right. Let's try, where are we at now? I'm just going to save this. And it looks like we got a span that we needed. Now I'm going to try it in our browser. Now we see we're getting the content of our citation here. Another thing you'll notice is that we're not getting automatic paragraph wrapping. Maybe I'll do that quick at the end here if we have time and people still care. But we've got our tag working the way we want it here. Now, insert bibliography is the other piece that we need. But let's finish off our citations. Let's make it use our nice tooltip functionality. You recall we have this tooltip function. We were using it earlier. Why not put the output of our citation in a tooltip? So rather than creating this quoted list, we can actually just call the function, the tooltip function. We can say tooltip, and then take this, because we're not escaping anymore. We're just using straight up function calls. I'm going to get rid of this bit here. And look at that, magically somehow my parentheses still line up. So Command I on a Mac will re-indent everything for you. Tooltip. We want to be careful of some things here. So tooltip itself uses this dot notation, which means it's going to take whatever arguments you give them and wrap them in this list. The classical way around this is to use the word apply. So, for example, what's a good example of this? If I define a function how do I illustrate this? We don't want tooltip to get this thing and then put it in a list. We want to pass it a list of things. So what I'm going to do is take away our list trick that we did before. Oh no, I'm going to leave it in. I'm just going to use apply. Apply takes a list. It does the kind of the reverse of what this does. You guys can tell me if I'm not making any sense, but if you say string append 1, 2, 3, for example, you get a single string back, 1, 2, 3. If you say string append and then you give it a list, 1, 2, 3, you're going to get an error. It wanted a string, but you gave it a list of things. But sometimes the list is what you have, you know. Let's say if x is 1, 2, 3. So now you want to string append that. Well, you can't string append x because it's the same thing as what we did above. You gave it a list instead of a string. Apply gets you around that error. So if you apply string append x, it looks at the list x and it just does a function call the way using string append as the function and gives it x the list of arguments, and you get the thing you want. So I'm doing that here with tooltip. I'm applying tooltip to whatever I get out of here. Thinking in lists is a bit of a mind bender when you first get started, but it becomes second nature the more you do it, and manipulating lists becomes second nature. Lists are not that difficult. It's just you need to think in terms of them. So I'm going to save all files. We're going to get this out. If I go back up here, what did I get? I got my span that I wanted with my content. So what am I going to see in my web page? It looks like it's working to me. I'm guessing it's going to work. So right where our site tag is, I have a little plus sign. Unfortunately, I am not seeing all the contents of the citation. I'm not seeing pages 3 through 5, and the reason for that is because of the flaw that I mentioned in our tooltip tag here. I'm only using the first element in our list. So what I really want to do is use all the elements and splice them in directly. In fact, yeah, I'll just leave it like that. Okay. We're going to see our pages 3 through 5 now. There it is. So now we have a nice little citation spot here, and to wrap it up, let's put I'll implement our last tag. Insert bibliography tag function. No arguments needed. I'll start a new function definition up here. Insert bibliography. Here's this is again. We have a hash table. One of the properties of hash tables in most languages, including Racket, is that you get a bunch of keys and a bunch of values, but they're not necessarily in any particular order. So the simplest way to do this would be, we can use our list comprehension functions. Let's see here. Oh no, what we want is in hash or in dict. So, let's just do some defining. Let's create our list of, we don't know what we want this thing to look like. Maybe we'll have an ordered list. So, we're going to define the list items to be for list. We're going to do key and val in dict citations table. There's a lot of parentheses in this expression, but that's because it's so dang powerful. You can have multiple things here, and you can and it will iterate through them for you in either in pairs or or as like a traditional nested for loop. So there's our list of sequences, and I'm going to create a li tag containing, actually all we care about are the values for now, but I'll leave it there because we might want to sort by the keys, for example. So we can take the val. Yeah, we'll just take that. No, the val will be a list. That's right. We want to keep that as a. So what that's going to do is it's going to go through every key value pair that's in that table, and it's going to produce this expression for each one of them, and then the results of each one, they all get gathered back up into a list. That's what this thing here is. So now we have a list called list items. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have an ordered list with the contents of list items. Okay. Now I'm going to run that. I don't have indict. Is that because I'm missing? It's from Racket dict. Well, maybe I'll do in hash instead because that's included by default. I will leave the difference between in hash and indict as an exercise for the viewer. In hash would have been the more obvious choice anyways. Yeah, Racket base. Okay, let's do that. Now, see, I'm getting no def for doc here. Let me try running my new function, insert bibliography. It's an empty list. If I run this now, I should get, though, an ordered list with the Racket reference inside it at the bottom. Let's see what it looks like in the browser. I'm going to close the... you see there it is at the bottom. We might decide that we want a heading over it. For example, a level 2 heading. This brings up another problem. How do you return more than one X expression? The heading can't contain the ordered list. It has to be a sibling of the ordered list. When you have that situation, you can use the @ as a, this is a splicing tag function. So we can have multiple, what it basically means is it's going to, it's a bag that can hold more than one sibling X expression, and then the @ kind of goes away. It does the same thing as this splicing is unquote in here. So we're going to do H1, we'll call it bibliography, or we could call it references, or whatever we wanted, or we could even make that a function, an argument, but we'll get to that later. So we have the H1, oh yeah, we wanted to do H2, I think, or H3. I think I'm already using H2. Okay. Okay. Let's try it now. I'm not even going to test it here. Let's go straight to the chase. I'm so confident. Now we have a heading, bibliography. And there is our one. Now let's do more than one. Let's do another citation. And let's say that we want them to appear in order, in alphabetical order of their keys. By the way, we don't have to use a symbol here. We can use one. You have to think about what you want it to look like in your document. If you want it to be roughly alphabetical by title, for example, you can use that key, and then we want to remember to change it down here. Let's say we want I, Muse in the machine, David Schillerter. Now I'm not even going to reference in the document, but it will appear in our bibliography. But what order will it appear in? We have no idea. It happens to appear in alphabetical order. I have no idea why. There's nothing in Racket that guarantees that necessarily. If you wanted to guarantee it, you know, I mean, I don't even know if I switch up the order here. It's kind of a last in, first out type of situation. And the order is unchanged. If I put this as a Z, is it sorting them for me? Well, it appears that if you use symbols, at least, it will tend to sort them alphabetically. The way to guarantee it, though, would be to put all of the keys in a list, a canonical list, which when you have things in a list, the order of the things in the list is guaranteed. You would want to get the hash keys. So you could say, you could do it this way. If I say keys is the hash keys of citations table. In fact, I can, I don't have any, again, I don't have any here, but I can use it in here. So you can see I get, when I use this hash keys function, it's going to return me a list of the keys. Let's do that again here because I now have two keys. Gives me a list of the keys. And you can sort that list using the sort function. So if you sort, I can't remember, you know, again, I'm a very intermediate, but if you want to do a sort, you can pass the sort function a comparison function. So you give it the list first, looks like, and then the comparison function. I wonder, since these are not strings, there's a string less than function, lexicographically sorted increasing. So that's probably what we'd use there. Again, this is getting into Racket basic Racket vocabulary, but we could say the keys are, we'll map, create, we'll because we're using symbols and not strings, we got to convert them to strings. And we'll say, whoops, you know, we can say define keys 2 is the sorted is sort keys string less than. Now we have a sorted list of the keys, and then we can kind of define sim sorted keys. We'll make them back into function or into symbols. Map string symbol, because the hash table is using symbols, not strings, as keys. If we use strings, we're not going to get anything out on keys. SRT. And then we can just do for list. We're going to call it item instead of in list. Going to do at hash ref citations table item. all that work to basically get the same thing that we had before, but now we are not relying on Racket happening to have given us the items in alphabetical order. We know for sure that they will be in alphabetical order because we're building an alphabetical ordered list of the keys. So we're saying that we want them to appear in alphabetical order by these keys that we're using that the reader never sees. So that is what's going on there. Our cookbook is getting a little bit bigger. You know, and we didn't even get to links yet. I suppose I should do a quick link function because every web page needs links. Let's do down here under the quick one is link. We want a URL, and then we want any number of elements. Href is the URL. We just use a single comma because a URL is a single value, not a list. And then we splice in the elements. There we go. We have a link now. So I could make this, if I wanted even more tags in here, I would put link, and then the URL would be either this or the Rickroll video or whatever you want. Contains all that. Contains all that. Let's see what we get, just to be sure that it's working properly. See, I'm getting a link in here. That's fine. Now we have a link down here inside our, well, I didn't put a link in that one. I'll change this to be a reference to ZMuse so that I can see that hyperlink inside the tooltip. There we go. It's purple. And I misspelled David Gillernter's name. That's not cool. But we can fix that with styling. And here's everything that we put in there. Again, so these are all just function calls. This doesn't actually look great. It's not fun to type all those brackets, but it's up to you to decide the function, the markup, however you want. You might even decide define citation is too big. You could use a $sign as your name of your function, and you might decide that you want to give it the title Muse in the machine as the first argument, and then anything that would follow that, and then it would generate the link and everything for you. If we were to design citations markup on more of a LaTeX model, of course, we would probably create structures. If you wanted to get super Baroque about it, you could say define. No, sorry, that's not it. It's struct work, and then it would contain a title, an author, pages, URL, maybe not necessarily in that order, and then so that creates a struct that carries all that information inside it. And you would use that struct to build up the X expression the way you want it to look, depending on what citation style you're using. And so then now I can say define Muse work Dave G. This doesn't have to be a well-formed URL for this example. So what is Muse now? Well, it's a work. And if I say what's the work author of Muse, I get Dave G. So if you want it to be super structured, you can use structs and build up a library and then swap in different styles. I just kind of did it the most basic way I could imagine. But if you are looking at this and saying, I super do not like all of those curly braces, I super don't like having this gnarly link tag in there. There are many infinite routes, as with cooking and food. There's infinite routes to get to this hash table, and how you fill it up, how you parse strings, how you use functions is up to you. But this is the basic strategy. So I think we've basically got what we came for. Project setup, code blocks, and citations. What would the Pollen markup look like as a struct, asks Zach. Good question. You can, I'm not sure where it is in the Pollen documentation, but it's going to be useful to review, I think. It says Pollen markup versus XML. There's a spot in the documentation, and I forget where it is to begin with. But talks about how to understand the equivalence between Pollen markup style and kind of traditional Racket style. I wish I could remember where exactly that was. Programming Pollen might be it. But kind of what the question, yeah, okay, so what would it look like aesthetically? Well, the reason I bring up the equivalence is, again, you can you should be able to, when you're going to be working with Pollen, you're going to want to be able to translate in your mind between this style and the exact same thing in Racket style, which is with the parentheses. Now, I'm using the old one. I understand you're asking about structs, but let me just illustrate here. Okay, so this is exactly equivalent to, these two lines are exactly equivalent. The reason that this notation exists is because you don't always want to be quoting your strings all the time when you're writing a document. But if you think of it as, you know, when using this one without the parentheses, whatever's inside the square brackets gets used as a literal Racket value, so you do need to quote those. But then whatever's inside the curly brackets can either be another kind of tag function of the same syntax or more text, and that gets quoted. So what I did over on the other side here was I created define Muse this ... Let me just save this. I think, and when you create structs, you actually also need to provide them out separately. Well, let's see. Let me do it without. Let me just assume that this is covering me here, and I'm going to get this struct. What it would look like here is define. Well, you could just do it like this. You could do it the exact same way with a lozenge in front of it. I could just copy and paste it here. and you get the exact same thing. But let's translate it into the Pollen markup format. I mean, I could actually just do it like that. I wonder if that works. Did I save this? Never actually used a struct directly in a Pollen document, but let's see what muse is. It's the same thing. So I can do work URL muse, get back the URL. So that would be that's just one way to do it. You might be better served if you were going to use structs to create a function that makes it a little clearer. A lot of times we call these make work, and you can use these keywords. Again, this is just another example. Title T, author A, pages P, URL U. This is just kind of a wrapper function that does and so that kind of makes it, these are called keyword arguments. You can also supply default values for arguments. And in that case, you would be you're still defining a value here, but then you would be supplying them each argument with a keyword that makes it more obvious. Or you can do it, so that's one approach you can do. You could also create an argument that says, my new site def, and just kind of pass it a big string. Use in the machine, and then just separate things with pipes. Dave G, google.com, and now all you're doing is giving it a string and kind of lightweight, and then have that function, this new function, just split the string apart. And yeah, that's the thing. So when you want, sometimes the default Racket struct syntax, you just kind of give it all the things without really saying what they are. And doing it this way gives you a little more clarity when you're going back and reading it later as to what you're doing. And structs actually in Racket can also have inheritance too. So we could really get into the weeds with this, and I definitely think we will at some point. I have an idea in mind for creating kind of maybe a separate Racket package that people could use to do all this, and because it's it's one of the common things that a lot of people want to do, and you could tell it would define different citation styles, Chicago Manual of Style or whatever, and it would spit them out in whatever predefined format you wanted. But that is a lot of work. But the point is, because you have your own programming language that's a platform for doing this, you can actually make it look however you want. It's just a matter of what kinds of things are you doing in your documents, and what do you want to be and what do you want it to look like. And then you have complete control of the markup. You have complete control of the output of that markup forever, basically, because you're the one doing all the work. So you can have structs also as hash tables being key value. We can we could define. Now this isn't going to work in our document because of the way that we're interpreting the output, but define citation actually a struct muse. Well, we'll make it a list. No, we'll just make it a muse. There. Now, hash ref citation table actually struct. You get the same thing out of there. Gave it to us in a list. Oh, that's because maybe it returns a list of the values. I'm not sure. Not sure why it gave it back to us in a list, but the point is that the struct is still intact inside the hash table. So when you get it back out again, you can run the same functions on it and get its values out of it. You can even test to see, you know, is this value in fact a work? Yes, it is. Is the number 3 a work? No, it is not. So defining a struct kind of gets you all of these helper functions, getters and setters and predicates. And I guess those definitions do get included in that all defined out. I don't have anything else. It's been about an hour and a half. It's what seems to be the typical runtime for pokey old me to get through some basic concepts. So if you guys have any follow-up questions, you can definitely, there's any number of things you can do. If you go to the GitHub repo, where did I go here? Cookbook. And just, you could shoot an issue in there if you had an idea. I am running, of course, this Pollen Time email newsletter. All I'm doing is whenever I figure out when I'm going to run the next one, I'll send out an email. And you can respond. If you sign up for that, you can just reply to those emails, and I'll get those replies. My email address, my website is joelduick.com. My email address is joel@jduick.net. For various historical reasons, had that one forever. And I'm also on the, definitely don't hesitate. If you, where was I? How did I get here? If you have an issue specifically with the Pollen Cookbook, it'd be a good place to do it there. The Pollen users group GitHub repo is a great place to ask questions, even simple questions. Matthew is so fast that I can hardly he usually will answer before anyone else. I guess there's Sorwe and some of the others will get in there, but I'll definitely will answer if I see it and nobody else has answered yet. Pollen users, if you have a pollen question, I'll be, if I don't have anything else to do, I'll be taking ideas from there. Where did I see pollen? I do have a lot of ideas for upcoming topics. And I wrote down a list of them somewhere. I can't remember what it was, where I put it. It might have been in this first one. Oh yeah, here we go. Generating side notes, grabbing bits from one document to include in another, generating PDFs with Quad. I know in principle how to do this stuff. I just have never got around to trying it. Publishing a podcast with a pollen book, making an ebook with pollen. That one's going to be a lot more tedious, but it could be worth it. But there might be some more basic stuff that people want to do, and I have ideas for those as well. But if I see anything anywhere that I could use as a topic, I'm going to use it. It's going to get bumped to the top of the list. So maybe sign up for that if you really want to be notified. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm just at Joel D. I'll usually try and post a reminder there, but if you're watching the Pollen Cookbook repo, or if you're watching the Pollen Users repo, and if you're subscribed to the email address, one of those three, you'll see it for sure. So really appreciate everybody coming by, giving me a chance to talk about my favorite nerdy topic, and we will be seeing you again soon.